Hello, guys. Welcome to Psyched Minds. We are reading Ordinary People by Judith Guest, Chapter 5. If you have not subscribed yet to the channel, do subscribe. We are reading Ordinary People. The building is shabby, and inside, the lobby is hot and dark. He glances at his watch, too dark in here to make out the numbers. The crisp and sunny day he has left outside has nearly blinded him. A directory on the far wall. He goes to it, scans the list of names, 11 in all. 7 with MD after them. The top names on the list is the one he's looking for, T.C. Berger, MD 202. Would any of these guys be of any use in an emergency? All specialists, podiatrists, optometrists, psychiatrists. But what if an accident were to happen in front of the building? Or a mugging? It looks like a great neighborhood for mugging. Glancing at his watch again, he finds his eyes have adjusted to the dim light. 4 o'clock. Exactly. Well then, get on it. No backing out now. An idea he has toyed with all week, not going, just not showing up, won't work. He is to meet his father at his office at 5:15. Don't be late. I've got a meeting tonight. I would like to get out of there as close to 5 as I can. Translated, don't let the guy upset you. Show up when you are supposed to. It only takes 10 minutes to walk from Sherman and 10th to the plaza. I have clocked it. No, not fair. Not necessary to take everything so personally. He probably does have a meeting tonight. Everything is all right. Everything is fine. Keep it that way. On an even keel, as his grandfather would say, stuck between the directory and the wall is a small white business card. I love you. Is this okay? Jesus C. The edges of it are furred, curved slightly inward as if it has been there a long time. He shakes his head, making for the staircase, forces a growl from the back of his throat. He is being strangled in the narrow hallway on the second floor. A single light bulb bumps helpless against the invading gloom. High, old-fashioned doors with windows of bubbled glass in them, all dark on both sides of the halls, looking as if they haven't been used for years. Any people in this building? Is this an emergency? Even a podiatrist would do. Panic begins to settle in around him. At the end of the hall is a doorway with light behind it. He goes to it. The letters stuck to the opaque glass with adhesive backing spell out T.C. Berger, M.D. They slant upward, crooked rectangles like a kid would print them on unlined paper. He pushes experimentally at the door, but it works on a heavy spring mechanism. Even when he turns the knob, it doesn't give. He pushes hard this time and it opens. He steps inside. The door closes sharply behind him. He is an entry, empty of people, longer than it is deep, with a chair in it, a floor lamp, a small table strewn with magazines, a green metal waste basket. Barely furnished, the room still seems cluttered. Opposite him is a doorway. An overturned chair blocks it. From inside the other room, mysterious shuffling sounds are issuing. A scene of total disorder confronts him as he moves towards the door. Books, magazines, loose piles of paper are everywhere. Empty plastic cups, pieces of clothing, a cardboard box, the bakery lettered in script on its lids, all tossed together in the middle of the floor. Several ashtrays are dumped upside down on the rug. A gooseneck lamp lies like a dead snake beside them. In the midst of it, a man stands, bent over, his back to the doorway. As Conrad approaches, he turns. About him, there is the look of a crafty monkey. Dark skin, dark wrinkly hair sprouting in tufts about his face, a body that hunches forward, an elongated question mark. Wait, he says. Don't tell me. Jarrett. The eyes, a compelling and vivid blue, beam into whatever they touch. They touch Conrad's face now, and the effect is that of being in an intense blue spotlight. He snaps his fingers. Yeah, you look like somebody Crawford would send me. Somebody who's a match for my daring wit an inquiring mind. Conrad, cool and polite, asks, "Am I seeing you, or are you seeing me?" He laughs, delighted. "That ought to be easy. This is my office, or yours?" No, no good. Lots of guys in this business make house calls now. "Let's see your appointment book." He steps over to his desk, rummaging fiercely for a minute. He comes up with a grey stenographer notebook. "Here, Tuesday, 4 o'clock, Conrad Jarrett." "Ah, I knew it." He grins then. Conrad is not easily charmed or fooled. Eccentricity, a favorite put on of psychiatrists. He does not trust them. Too many oddballs floating around the hospital. Only Crawford had behaved as if he knew what he was doing. He bends to pick up the overturned chair. "Bring that over here," Berger directs him. "Sit down." He continues to prowl around the room, lifting books, setting them aside, retrieving papers from the floor, stacking up empty plastic cups. On further examination, he resembles a compact, slightly undersized gorilla. Conrad cannot take his eyes off him. "I think I was ripped off this afternoon," he says. "Or else the cleaning lady did one hell of a job on me. Place didn't look this bad when I left. Somebody was after drugs, I guess. What a neighborhood. Nothing but placebos here. Use them myself for quick energy sometimes, just sugar." He smiles, arms raised, palms turned up in an attitude of perplexity. "You were robbed? Looks like. You going to call somebody?" "Who, you mean cops?" He shrugs. "What's missing? Maybe nothing. Maybe they even left something. Who knows?" He moves to the small sink, half hidden in the corner behind a huge pile of books. "You want some coffee? Listen, do me a favor. Look on the desk there. See if you can find a data sheet. You know, name, age, date of birth, etc. Fill it out for me, will you? Gotta keep records, the state says. Rules." He sighs. "Now what am I supposed to do with those poor bastards lying on the floor, I ask you?" He indicates the overturned filing cabinet. It contents scattered. "Did you say yes or no?" "What?" "Coffee. Yes or no? Sit down, sit down." "No thanks." Obediently, he goes to the desk, searches through the papers on top of it until he comes up with a blank information card. He begins to fill it out. Berger empties the other chair of debris and drags it over to the desk. "How long since you left the hospital?" "A month and a half." "Feeling depressed?" "No." "On stage?" "Pardon?" People nervous? Treat you like you're dangerous men?" He shrugs. "Yeah, a little, I guess." "And are you?" "I don't know." Berger grins then. "You look sensible enough to me. At least you looked sensibly disgusted when you walked in here. God, it is disgusting, isn't it? The second time this year. What do you think I ought to do about it?" He's used to this technique. He looks for psychological design in the cushion. No, too far-fetched. Nobody would go to this much trouble just to set up a test for him. He says, "I guess I would just clean it up and forget about it." "Yeah, you're right. Christ. What a gigantic pain in the tail though, huh?" The man sits back, fingers curved around his coffee cup, watching as Conrad finishes filling out the card. "Sure you don't want any coffee? I've got clean cups around here somewhere." Conrad shakes his head, hands him the card. He reads it quickly. "Good, strong print. Neat, like an engineer. So, what are you doing here? You look like a healthy kid to me." "What I am doing here," Conrad says, "is that I had to come." Berger nods. "Uh-huh. Rules again. Authority reigns." He tosses the card onto the desk. "So suppose you didn't have to come. What would you be here for?" "I wouldn't." He finds himself firmly enveloped in the piercing blue gaze, shifts uncomfortably in the chair. "How long were you there?" 8 months. "What did you do? OD? Make too much noise in the library?" "No." Looks steadily at the bookcase in front of him, floor to ceiling jammed with books. "I tried to off myself." Berger picks up the card again, studies it as he blows on his coffee. "What with? Pills? Gillette Super Blue?" He sees the way to handle this guy. Keep it light, a joker, slide out from under without damage. "It was a Platinum Plus," he says. The eyes are fixed upon him thoughtfully. They hold him still. "So how does it feel to be home? Everybody glad to see you?" "Yeah, sure." "Your friends, everything okay with them?" Fine. It says here no sisters, no brothers, right? Right, he says. Don't squirm, don't panic, release it's inevitable. Soon, soon. Berger leans back in the chair, hands behind his head. It is hard to figure his age. He could be 25, he could be 40. So why do you want to work on? He asks. Pardon? Well, your hair, it's your money, so to speak. What do you want to change? He thinks then of his father, of their struggle to keep between them a screen of calm and order. I would like to be more in control, I guess, so people can quit worrying about me. So who is worrying about you? My father mostly. This is his idea. How about your mother? Isn't she worried? No. How come? She's, I don't know, she's not a worrier. No. What does she do then? Do? Yeah, what is her general policy towards you? You get along with her all right? Yeah, fine. He's abruptly uncomfortable. An endless grilling process like it was in the hospital. He forgot how it tightened him up, how much he used to hate it. You've got a funny look on your face, Berger says. What are you thinking? I'm thinking, he says, if you're a friend of Crawford's, you are probably okay, but I don't like this already. Look, what do you know about me? Have you talked to Crawford? No. The blue high beams have switched to low. The smile is benign. He told me your name, that's all. Told me to look after you. Look for you. Okay, I'll tell you some things. He turns his head slightly, taking in the narrow window at the left of the bookcase. Sunlight streams in from the slot, cutting a bright path across the carpeting. I had a brother. He's dead. It was an accident on the lake. We were sailing. He drowned. When? Summer before last. Staring now at the bookcase, he tries to make out the titles of the book from where he's sitting. He cannot. They are too far away. I suppose you and Crawford talked about it, Berger says. Every day. And you don't like to talk about it? He shrugs. It doesn't change anything. A pigeon, dull grey, lights on the cement windowsill. It pecks inquiringly at the window for a moment, then flies off. Okay, Berger says. Anything else? No, he says. Yeah, about friends. I don't have any. I got sort of out of touch before I left. Oh. He does not respond to this technique, the comments in the form of a question. He had cured Crawford of it by telling him it was impossible to concentrate on what a person was saying if you were listening for his voice to go up at the end of the sentence. Well, okay, Berger says. I would better tell you, I'm not big on control. I prefer things fluid, in motion, but it's your money, so to speak. So to speak, yeah. Berger laughs, reaching for his notebook. How's Tuesday and Friday? Twice a week? He shrugs. Control is a tough nut. I've got swim practice every night. That's a problem. So how do we solve it? A long, uncomfortable silence. He's tired and irritated, and again, there are no choices. It only looks as if there are. I guess I skip practice and come here twice a week, he says. Okie dokie. It is over, and Berger walks him to the door. The schedule, he says, is based on patient ratings. A scale of 1 to 10. The higher I rate, the fewer times you gotta come. Example, you rate me 10. You only have to see me once a week. Conrad laughs. That's crazy. Hey, I'm the doctor. Berger grins at him. You're the patient. The first session has been gotten through, and the guy is not bad. At least he's loose. The exchange about the razor blades reminded him of something good about the hospital. Nobody hid anything there. People kiddied you about all kinds of things, and it was all right. It even helped to stay the flood of shame and guilt. Remembering that day at lunch when Stan Carmichael rose from his chair, pointing his finger in stern accusation. Profane and unholy boy, sinner against God and man, father and mother. Robbie prompted him, and the Holy Ghost, Stan, and he ranted on. And the Holy Ghost, fall on your knees, repent of evil, ask forgiveness for your profane and evil ways, Conrad Keith Jarrett. And he had nodded, eating on, while Robbie leaned across the table and asked, Stan, may I have your gingerbread? Just if you are not going to eat it, buddy. And Stan broke off his ravings to snarl petulantly. God damn it, Rob, you are a leech. You scrounge off my plate at every meal. It's disgusting. So, how do you stay open when nobody mentions anything, when everybody is careful not to mention it? Ah, shit, Jarrett. What do you want? Want people to say, gee, we are glad you didn't die? Poor taste, poor taste. He is suddenly aware of the other people on the street, hurrying by, intent upon their business. See, no one's excusing. They don't even seem repelled. As a matter of fact, they don't even notice. So, no need to be affected by them either, right? Still, as they pass him, he carefully averts his gaze. That brings us to the end of chapter 5, chapter 6. Cherry comes in coatless, breathless, late from her lunch hour again. She gives Cal the practiced, wide-eyed smile. What are you looking for, Mr. Jarrett? If it's Braddock, that's on Mr. Hanley's desk. I'll get it for you. That's all right. He nods curtly. I'm looking for the Sandlin account. I had it the other day. Oh, just a sec. I know right where that is. I'll bring it into you. Okay? And again, the smile. A tall, big-boned girl who wears too much makeup and her skirt is too short. He has noticed lately that women aren't wearing their skirts short. It must be out of style again, and how it looks cheap. Or else he's getting old, and the secretaries get younger every year. Cherry is 19. Lord, was he even that young? Cherry. Now who the hell would give a daughter that silly name? Nobody would. It's a fake, like the smile. He goes into his office and stands in the window, waiting for the file, staring out at the flat red brick complex of buildings to the west. Evanston Township High School. Strange how institutional buildings resemble one another. He can spot them a mile off. That one looks much like the evangelical home. He glances at his calendar. Wednesday, November 5th. Get with Ray this afternoon about Braddock. Call George Sandlin's broker. Call Burns and Rouse. Set up a meeting for the 19th. Duties, services, advice. A good thing you do not have to know who you are, Jarrett, in order to perform, because today there is a minimum of information available on that subject. He hates fighting, and last night they had fought over London. I think you are being unreasonable, she said, not even daring to ask him about it. Why don't you just admit that it's you who doesn't want to go? You ask him then. What am I, the official interpreter here? You see him every day, don't you? Show him the travel folders, give him the pitch. I don't see him any more than you do, she said coolly. What are you afraid of? It's a question. It requires a yes or a no. You certainly ask him enough other questions. How did he sleep? How does he feel? How did I sleep? How do I feel? Okay, he said. How did you sleep? How do you feel? That's not it, she said. If we could all just relax a little, if things could just be normal again, I don't want you to start asking me the questions. I want you to just stop. Well, okay, fair enough. If she knew, though, that it is not only of Conrad but of himself that he is asking questions now, basic, hopeless questions that mock him, finger him as a joker, a bumbler, a poor dope. Who the hell are you? As he walks down the street, and who can step in time to that music for more than 30 seconds. He ducks into a drugstore for respite, buys himself a cigar. Who the hell are you? Follow him inside. Leaning on the glass counter, waiting. Maybe everybody does it. That is the thought he hangs on to. Like a drunk at a friendly lamppost. Who in the world knows who he is all the time? It is not a question to ask a guy over a sandwich at the quick lunch. It is, if you must ponder it, then do it alone at isolated periods with with long intervals in between, as not to drive yourself bats. I'm the kind of man who, he has heard this phrase a million times at parties and bars in the course of normal conversations. I'm the kind of man who instinctively he listens, tries to apply any familiar terms to himself, but without success. Arnold Bacon. There was a man who knew who he was. Years since he has thought about him. In 1967, Ray noticed the obit in the Tribune. Nationally known tax attorney dies at 72. Tragic loss to the profession. ABA president says He was 17 years old when he first met Arnold Bacon. 17, a senior in high school, his plans for the future not extending past the next afternoon, and Bacon had come up to him at, of all places, a Christmas tea in the lounge of the evangelical home. Well, young man, what are you planning to do with the rest of your life? He had laughed politely, looking for a neat and pleasant exit to the conversation, but Bacon was serious. I've looked at your grades, he said. You're smart, you know, the importance of great good education. You ever thought about going into law? He had thought about being a soldier of fortune after reading The Three Musketeers, or a fireman, a professional athlete. He was a good tennis player, he was well coordinated, he learned games quickly. Those vague and wistful occupations faded out of the picture after the December afternoon. He did more than think about the law. He applied and was accepted to pre-law at Wayne University. He took a part-time job clerking in Bacon's office. He graduated from Wayne and was accepted into law school at the University of Michigan, backed by Bacon's influential recommendation, he later found out, from one of the deans. A lucky accident. Bacon took him on, decided to be his mentor, told him what course to take and which ones to stay away from, which scholarship to apply for, which professors he must not miss. He came to his aid financially whenever it was necessary. It was the closest thing to a father-son relationship. It was a father-son relationship, he thought. Bacon had one daughter, no sons. Bacon's daughter might have made a smashing lawyer, but women lawyers were rarer than and suspect. And he had this reverence, this vast, eclipsing love for the law that had to be coalesced. He needed a student, an apprentice. He needed to know that he was leaving this baby protected. Bacon had not approved of law students who married while they were in school. Diffusion of energy, he called it. And so, of course, everything had changed after Beth. Bacon was a man of strong views. He had principles, integrity. He knew who he was and where he stood on certain, what he considered inviolable issues. Bacon had been Cal's first actual experience with loss. When he was 11, he learned the association of that word with death. The director of the evangelical home had called him in to tell him of loss. His mother had passed away. Another wraith-like being who inhabited east wings of the home. Another term he was more familiar with, having heard it most frequently in connection with the elderly, wraith-like beings who inhabited the east wing of the home, coming and going very quickly. He remembered the feeling of awe that possessed him that day. He was aware that an event of some magnitude had happened to him. Someone close to him had passed away, and it was his loss, and his alone. For a short time he became a figure of some importance to his peers, and he was invited to the director's office for cocoa and sermons on love and loss and how a Christian deals with grief. The only difference he perceived was that he no longer had any visitors or presents on his birthday or at Christmas. Well, that wasn't true really. He had presents. They just weren't from anyone he knew. But he did not, at the time, understand the meaning of loss and of grief. He still had not experienced those words at all. He had grieved over Arnoldo, though. Not when he died, it was too late then, years since he had seen him, but when he discovered that it had been a business venture, after all, that had felt like grief. It was grief. He and Beth had together repaid the money. It was, as Bacon pointed out to him, a financial obligation. It took 5 years, but it was not a hardship. Beth had her own money, he had a good scholarship, and they hardly felt the monthly bill. But Arnold's indifference after the marriage that had hurt him so much, it had undermined him, taken away something that he hadn't even realized he possessed. He had regarded it so lightly, so casually. Cherry swings into the room with her smile to put the paper on his desk. Seductively, that is how she does it. She works hard at it, too hard. She has a good telephone voice, that's about it. Can't take dictation worth a damn, and she won't file. He wonders where she found this one. She must have had to do some hunting for it. Her boyfriend goes to Northwestern, gets out of the class at 5 o'clock each day. She has informed them. She is firm about leaving the office at exactly that time. Her habit of sneaking error spotted letters on the desk for the signatures, as she gives him the look of wide eyed innocence, drives him crazy. What would Bacon have to say about a secretary like this? Calvin, you get what you deserve. I'm the kind of man who hasn't the least idea what kind of a man I am. There, some definition. He's no closer than he was back in the director's office, back when he listened to the sermons, his mind wandering, not even aware then that he was searching. So, how does a Christian deal with grief? There is no dealing, he knows that much. There is simply the stubborn, mindless hanging on until it is over, until you are through it. But something that has happened in the process. The old definitions, the neat, knowing pigeonholes have disappeared, or else they no longer apply. His eyes move again to the calendar. Wednesday, November 5th. Of course, obvious. All the painful self examination, the unanswered questions. At least he knows what is wrong today. Today is Jordan's birthday. Today he would have been 19th. That brings us to the end of chapter 7. 6. Chapter 7. Karen smiles at him, deep dimples in her cheeks. He had forgotten that about her, had forgotten how she lowers her head when she is embarrassed or nervous. Nervous now as she sits down across from him in the narrow booth. It makes him feel protective. She doesn't have to be afraid of him. Hi, how are you? Fine. And you? He grins, shrugs his shoulder. Not bad. Light, scattered paranoia, increasing to moderate during the day. He means merely to jog her memory, but she frowns and looks away. He has offended her. Hey, I'm only kidding. I'm fine, really. She leans awkwardly to the side, shrugging out of her coat, folds it neatly beside her on the seat. She has gained weight since the hospital. It looks good on her. She used to wear her hair long and straight. She would tuck it behind her ears while she talked. Now it is short, curling softly about her face, dark feathers that brush against her cheeks. I like your hair that way. Thank you. She touches it. She touches and straightens her coat again. They look at each other, slowly sinking in the awkwardness of the moment. He didn't want that to happen. They were good friends at the hospital. They still are. No reason to be uncomfortable, is there? She asks, when did you come home? End of August. A place where they were both safe. They talked for hours on the stone bench outside the rec room door. Sometimes Leo would come and sit with them, cracking jokes, finding out they are alive. Surely she must remember. It's great to see you, he says. Good to see you. Again she ducks her head. I can't stay for too long. I've got a meeting at school. Our drama club is doing 1,000 clowns, the Herb Gardner play. Do you know it? We are going wild trying to get it together. I'm secretary this year. That's probably why we are so disorganized. He says bluntly, well, don't let me hold you up then. All that time to get here so he can have a Coke in the drugstore because it is near her house in Skokie. And she sits there as if she's being held prisoner. What a stupid idea. Sorry he thought of it. Sorry he called her at all. I came because you asked me to, she says quietly. And sorry again for being rude and for exposing himself and his goddamn needs again. Jared, when will you grow up? You kids gonna order or what? The counterman doubles as the waiter when things are slow. As they are on this Saturday morning, he eyes them with hostile boredom. I'll have a Coke, Conrad says. Just black coffee for me. Karen gives him a pleasant smile, nothing doing. He scribbles off a bill and slaps it down on the table with a grunt of annoyance. Not the type to be won over so easily. Have to come up with something better. $1 million order, maybe. Conrad pulls his eyebrow together, mocking him, and Karen giggles. She bites her lips, looking down at the table. There, that's better. He says, I'm sorry. I didn't mean that. It's okay. I didn't mean to sound so rah-rah either. I really didn't want to see you. Only I was sort of afraid. You seemed so down over the phone. I'm not down, he says quickly. Hey, everything's going great. I'm back in school. I'm swimming. Oh, really? I'm glad. Well, we haven't had any meets yet. I could end up on the bench all year. Oh no, you will do fine, I'm sure. The man returns. He is small and undernourished looking, sour. In silence, Conrad slides out of the booth to pay him. He looks at the coin suspiciously, turns away without a word. Conrad shakes his head. Hostile. She giggles. Definitely a low self image day. And they relax. She, the seasoned veteran, out 6 months to his three, asks, Are you seeing anybody? A doctor? Yeah, are you? She shakes her head and obscurely he feels ashamed. Another black mark against him. Dr. Crawford gave me a name, she says, and I went for a while, but then I finally decided it wasn't doing me any good. I mean, he wasn't telling me anything I couldn't figure out for myself. Really, the only one who can help you is you. Well, you and God. She stops, but it is only to take a breath. Anyway, that's what Dad says. And I know he's right. It's what they told us in the hospital too, didn't they? That you have to learn to help yourself, and this guy was over in Ike Grove village and expensive as hell. She looks at him and smiles. That isn't why I stopped going, though. And I don't mean that there isn't any value in it if you need it. I mean, for some people, it could be just the right thing. She looks to him for help, afraid that she has wounded him. To reassure her, he says, Well, I don't know how long I'll keep it up either. I got shoved into it, sort of my father. I don't think he's got that much confidence in me. He's pretty nervous about it all. Anyway, I only go to get my mind flushed out. After an hour with this guy, you are not too sure about him, but you are okay. Berger and his visits with him have gotten to be something that he looks forward to. A chance to feel better twice a week, even if the feeling doesn't have much carryover yet. Now, on top of the shame, is disgust with himself for his slandering words, not just Berger, but his father too. Christ, Jarrett, but you are a two-faced bastard, she says. Things were so different in the hospital. People were, turned on all the time, and you just can't live like that. You can't live with all that emotion floating around looking for a place to land. It's too exhausting. It takes too much energy just to get through a day, even without all that soul searching we used to do. Hey, he says, remember Crawford? How he was always telling you to go with the thing that made you laugh? Yesterday I heard a guy on the radio talking about how to take care of your stress. If you water after 5, be sure to water only every other root. In other words, he says, the US Department of Agriculture requests that you use alternative route after 5 o'clock. She is laughing at him at last. Con, you made that up? No, the guy said it. I swear. I laughed for 5 minutes. It made me feel good to know the nuts still have the chance to take over the world. In the hospital, he was the only one who could make her laugh. His heart swells with pleasure and gratitude. Calmly, so as not to alarm her, he says, losing a whole year out of your life is turning out to be sort of a disadvantage, don't you think? I don't think about it, she says. You shouldn't either. Just keep going. Get into things, forget about that. Try to be less intense. Well, that's what he was asking for, wasn't it? Then why do the words irritate him so? With an imaginary pencil, he writes in the palm of his hand, Just a minute. Less intense. Let me guess this all down. Guess, gee, you sure do make it sound simple, Dr. Eldridge. She frowns and looks away. It isn't simple, and I'm not saying everything is perfect, but at least try. But at least I try. I'm trying, he says. He makes a face teasing her. Don't I act like I'm trying? I don't know. I don't really know you're gone. This hurts. And then she looks at her watch, and this hurts too. I'm late. I've got to go. So okay, go. He spreads his hand, palms down on the table. She hesitates. Listen, call me again. I would like to see you. Really, I mean it. Will you? Sure, call me. I would like to see you. But not real soon. I might be crazy, but I'm not dumb. I read. She gathers her coat about her shoulders. The thing is, she says, we should both be careful about who we see. It isn't good for either of us to get down. I'm not down. It is definitely not the thing to be. More calmly, he repeats it. I'm not down. Well, it's contagious, you know that. Her voice is flat, accusing. We can't risk it. Okay. Nothing more to say. He glances across the aisle at the rack of paper packs, reading the titles in despair. What to wear and how to wear it, how to make the most of what you have got, 25 ways to be better, love making. Oh God, he did not come here to drain strength away from her. He would not do that to anyone, least of all her. They are friends, aren't they? She gets to her feet. I'm sorry, I wish I could stay longer. You look great, Gone. You really do. Yeah, thanks. You too. And you will call me? Yeah, sure. And then she is gone. He sits a while longer, planning the empty Coke glass back and forth palms, between his hands. He had thought this morning that he would ask her to one of these swim meets. How stupid even to think that she would go for that. Dull stuff anyway, compared to 1,000 clowns. Ah, come on, Jared, don't be a shit. She's a nice girl and she's right. It's a dangerous business. How would you like it if someone screwed up bastard coming out? If some screwed up bastard kept coming out around, asking you for help, asking you to make him feel necessary. There is a sign over the door, no loitering. The counterman waiter keeps glancing over, getting ready to catch him in the act. He carefully folds his straw into a small rectangle and drops it into the glass. Getting to his feet, he puts on his jacket. Okay, Karen, we'll see you around. Who needs you anyway? Who the fuck needs anybody? That brings us to the end of chapter 7. We'll be reading chapter 8 in the next reading. I will be ending the stream. If you have any questions, anything at all, any doubts or anything, you can reach out to me in the comment section of the video you're viewing or in the community section of the channel. Bye bye for now. Keep reading. Take care. Bye.